Silence in Hollywood is never accidental. It isn't passive, and it's certainly not free. More often than not, silence is traded like currency used to protect legacies, preserve reputations, and keep powerful images intact. Entire careers have been built on what people chose not to say, and entire disasters have been delayed simply because no one was willing to break the illusion of control. But the silence surrounding Albert Brooks feels different. This wasn't lawyers stepping in, and it wasn't damage control. This was something heavier, the kind of quiet that comes from pain settling deep in the chest and refusing to move. Albert Brooks is not a man who chases controversy. For decades, he avoided scandals, public feuds, and headline-grabbing interviews. So, when he finally spoke, people didn't lean in out of curiosity. They leaned in because something felt deeply wrong. This story isn't about a single tragic night inside a Brentwood home. That night was only the end of a much longer unraveling. What matters more are the years leading up to it, the warning signs that were noticed but softened, the discomfort that was sensed but politely ignored, and the moments when speaking up felt harder than staying quiet. In Hollywood, silence often feels safer than confrontation, especially when powerful families and carefully protected images are involved. Albert isn't just mourning the loss of a lifelong friend. He's breaking a silence that protected the wrong things for far too long. And the most unsettling question isn't what happened in the end. It's how many moments led there, how many chances passed quietly by, and how many people chose to look away believing that love, patience, and hope would somehow be enough. When Albert Brooks finally spoke, it wasn't in front of cameras or under studio lights. There was no polished interview, no carefully staged setting, and no attempt to soften what he was about to say. The people who heard him first were not the public, but a small circle of industry veterans, people who knew Rob Reiner long before awards, red carpets, and iconic careers. People who understood the full backstory. And what they heard wasn't a speech. It was exhaustion. It was frustration. It was the sound of someone carrying a truth for too long without knowing where to put it. Albert didn't sound angry in the way headlines like to frame anger. He sounded worn out, like someone who had replayed the same memories over and over, wondering at what point silence stopped being respectful and started becoming dangerous. He wasn't haunted by the act itself as much as he was haunted by everything that came before it, the years of warning signs, the moments when something clearly wasn't right, and the quiet understanding that speaking up might cost more than staying silent. That silence wasn't accidental. In Hollywood, silence is often rewarded. It keeps relationships intact. It avoids uncomfortable confrontations. It preserves the illusion that everything is under control. Albert understood that culture well. For decades, he lived inside it. And that's exactly why breaking that silence now matters, because what he's pointing to isn't a personal failure or a single bad decision. It's a pattern one where discomfort is managed instead of confronted, and where problems are softened until they become impossible to stop. Most people skim headlines and move on. They see words like family tragedy or mental health crisis and assume the story is already complete. Albert is pushing back against that instinct. He's saying that the public version of events leaves too much out, that it skips over the slow unraveling and jumps straight to the aftermath. And by doing that, it protects the very system that allowed the warning signs to be ignored in the first place. The uncomfortable truth Albert keeps circling back to is this: the danger wasn't invisible. It didn't come out of nowhere. It grew quietly, in plain sight, while everyone convinced themselves that patience, love, and privacy were enough. And that's why this story can't be reduced to a single night or a single moment. Because once you understand what Albert is really saying, the question isn't how this happened, it's how long it was allowed to keep happening without anyone stepping in. Albert Brooks didn't meet Rob Reiner through Hollywood. There were no agents, no auditions, no favors exchanged. They met as teenagers, long before anyone knew their names, long before careers and legacies complicated everything. They were just kids cracking jokes, chasing laughs, dreaming without understanding how heavy the future could become. That bond didn't form in a studio. It formed in classrooms, in shared awkward moments, in the kind of friendship that grows before ego and power ever enter the room. Over 6 decades, that friendship never turned transactional. As Rob's career took off, he became known as someone who stepped up, a connector, a mentor, a person who quietly opened doors for others. Albert watched that happen from the inside. He saw Rob help people when cameras weren't around, lift others without needing credit, and remain loyal long after fame gave him permission to move on. That's why Albert's voice matters here. He isn't dismantling a myth from the outside. He's describing a man he knew completely, including his kindness, his flaws, and the blind spots that came with loving too deeply. When everything collapsed, Albert didn't react like a commentator watching events unfold from a distance. He reacted like someone in shock. He kept driving. He kept replaying conversations. At one point, he even called Rob's number, not because he expected an answer, but because part of him still couldn't accept that a presence so constant could simply be gone. That moment says more than any headline ever could. This wasn't a professional loss. It was the disappearance of someone woven into every era of Albert's life. That history is what gives weight to what Albert says next. This isn't betrayal. It isn't bitterness. And it isn't hindsight dressed up as clarity. It's the perspective of someone who stood close enough to see the cracks forming while still believing, for a long time, that love and loyalty would be enough to hold everything together. And that's the tragedy buried inside this bond. Not that Albert didn't care enough, but that even someone this close wasn't able to stop what was coming. Albert Brooks has been very clear about one thing from the beginning. The warning signs were never hidden. They weren't subtle, and they didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. He says, "I was there, not once, not briefly, but over and over again 3 years ago, 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, sitting in that same living room, watching the situation slowly unravel while everyone around it tried to pretend it was still manageable. What made it so hard to confront wasn't ignorance. It was politeness. It was fear, and it was the unspoken rule that certain lines, especially inside powerful families, simply aren't crossed." Albert describes it like watching a disaster move closer in slow motion while nobody wants to be the one to say, "This isn't okay." Because saying that out loud doesn't just start an argument, it ends illusions. It forces decisions. And once those decisions are made, there's no going back. So instead, the danger was softened, excused, explained away. Not because people didn't care, but because caring too much made the truth unbearable. One night, about 8 months before everything finally collapsed, that quiet tension broke the surface. It was supposed to be a simple dinner, no confrontation planned, no drama expected, just Rob, Michelle, Albert, and a few familiar faces. Then Nick walked in. Anyone who has lived with long-term family instability knows what happens next. Conversations stop mid-sentence. People exchange looks without saying a word. The air in the room changes instantly. But Albert says the most painful part of that moment wasn't Nick's entrance. It was Rob's reaction. Rob stood up immediately, arms open, ready to pull his son close, acting as if everything was normal. Not because he was blind, and not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because he still had hope. Hope that maybe this time would be different. Hope that maybe this was the turning point. Albert pauses when he describes that moment, because hope can be beautiful. But when reality keeps proving otherwise, hope becomes dangerous. Nick wasn't there to eat. He wasn't there to catch up or smooth things over. He came with a demand serious money. The kind of money people use to patch problems that should have been confronted years earlier. The mood in the room flipped instantly. Plates went untouched. Conversations died. And when Albert looked at Michelle, he didn't see irritation or disappointment. He saw fear, real fear. And that detail matters, because that fear didn't start that night. It had been living in that house for years, unspoken and ignored. After seeing that look, Albert says he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He pulled Rob aside, away from the table, out onto the patio where no one else could hear. There was no soft language, no careful phrasing, no dancing around the issue. He asked his oldest friend a question that had been building for a long time. How long are you going to let him hold you hostage? What haunts Albert now isn't the question. It's Rob's answer. Rob didn't snap. He didn't defend Nick. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked exhausted, like a man carrying too much weight for too long. Then he said something Albert hasn't been able to forget. "If I stop, I lose him." In Rob's mind, pulling back didn't mean setting boundaries. It meant losing his son forever. He truly believed that his money, his attention, and his constant presence were the only things keeping everything from falling apart. That's the part Albert keeps coming back to. This wasn't a single emotional moment. It was a hostage state that lasted for years. A cycle where love stopped protecting and started removing consequences. Where every warning sign was met with another check, another excuse, another attempt to keep the peace. Albert isn't saying Nick was beyond help. He isn't saying Rob failed as a father. What he's saying is far more uncomfortable. Love that refuses to face reality doesn't stay harmless forever. Albert grew up around addiction. He saw plenty of lost people, plenty of chaos, plenty of pain. And he's clear about this. Not everyone in that position crosses this line. He believes there was something darker at work here. Not just confusion or illness, but deep resentment. Anger aimed directly at the people who raised him. And underneath that anger, jealousy, the kind that grows when you spend your entire life living under the shadow of a name as heavy as Rob Reiner's. From Albert's perspective, this didn't spiral by accident. It unfolded slowly, intentionally, while everyone hoped love alone could contain it. But hope doesn't stop storms. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. And once love becomes a substitute for boundaries, it doesn't just fail to protect it, quietly invites the danger closer and closer to home. What Albert Brooks starts to expose here isn't just a family breakdown. It's a system failure, a culture that teaches powerful people how to avoid consequences instead of confronting them, and then calls that avoidance compassion. Albert is careful not to turn mental health into a slogan or a shield. He acknowledges it, he respects it, but he refuses to let it become a free pass because from what he witnessed, that's exactly how it was used. Albert says he grew up around addiction. He saw chaos up close. He saw people spiral, relapse, hurt themselves and others. And he's clear about this. Not everyone in that position crosses this line. That matters, because it pushes back against the idea that what happened was inevitable. In Albert's view, this wasn't just illness or confusion running its course. There was something more personal, more corrosive underneath it, resentment that had been building for years. Growing up as Rob Reiner's son meant living under a shadow most people never experience. Every comparison was unavoidable. Every achievement was measured against legendary films, iconic lines, and a last name that carried enormous weight. Albert recalls moments where that resentment surfaced openly. On one occasion years earlier, someone casually mentioned Rob in conversation. Nick snapped instantly, not playfully, not defensively, furious. To Albert, that wasn't rebellion. It was bitterness, the kind that grows when someone feels invisible next to greatness. That bitterness didn't exist in a vacuum. It was constantly buffered by privilege. When things escalated, authorities weren't called. Consequences didn't arrive. Problems were handled quietly. Albert describes an incident where Nick allegedly threw a chair through a window, a moment that should have triggered serious intervention. Instead, it disappeared. Why? Because you don't call the police on Rob Reiner's son. You call a private doctor. You call a handler. You call someone whose job is to make the problem go away. This is where Albert's accusation cuts deepest. He believes the system didn't protect this family, it trapped them. Every time reality threatened to force a reckoning, money and influence bent the rules just enough to delay it. There was always another cushion, another explanation, another check written to calm things down. Without real consequences, there was never a true stopping point. And without a stopping point, the behavior didn't de-escalate, it escalated. Albert isn't attacking love. He isn't denying that Rob and Michelle cared deeply for their son. What he's saying is far more unsettling. Love, combined with privilege, can become dangerous when it replaces accountability. Instead of creating distance, it kept access open. Instead of closing doors, it left them unlocked. And over time, what was meant to protect the family only drew the danger closer to home. Hollywood has a name for this. They call it privacy. They call it discretion. They call it handling things internally. Albert calls it what it really is: silence rewarded by power. A system that bends instead of standing firm, and then acts shocked when the bend finally becomes a break. In his view, this wasn't an unavoidable tragedy. It was a long series of chances to intervene that were quietly passed over, one by one, until there were none left. Albert Brooks didn't learn what happened through a call from the family. He heard it through emergency radio traffic, cold fragments of information moving faster than compassion. By the time he reached Brentwood, the house was no longer a home. It was a perimeter. Lights, barriers, procedure. Albert stood behind tape like a stranger, watching 6 decades of friendship reduced to reports and protocols. In that moment, the cost of silence became undeniable. It hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. As the legal process took shape, Albert's fear shifted toward the story itself. He could already see how it might be softened, framed through trauma, pressure, and mental health until responsibility blurred. Albert doesn't deny those factors exist. He's afraid they'll be used to rewrite reality, to shift blame, to suggest Rob pushed too hard or not enough, to turn parents who can no longer speak into convenient explanations. That's why Albert refuses to stay quiet. He isn't chasing attention. He's carrying memories that never made headlines, warnings that were seen but never documented. And he's furious at what followed, the flood of public grief from people who hadn't spoken to Rob in years. Performative sympathy, offered after the fact. Albert wants answers instead. Who supplied Nick? Who drove him that night? Who kept making the problems disappear? One detail matters more than all the rest. Albert says Rob was afraid, not hypothetically, not peacefully drifting away. Afraid, and that fear matters in court, in memory, and in truth. Albert also admits something harder. He doesn't see himself as innocent. He wishes he had spoken louder, sooner. That regret isn't self-punishment, it's a warning. Silence doesn't just protect the wrong things. Sometimes it teaches everyone that waiting feels safer than acting until there's nothing left to save. Albert Brooks says there is one moment he keeps replaying more than any other because it didn't sound dramatic at all. It sounded calm, ordinary, almost procedural. Weeks before everything collapsed, Michelle Reiner called him unexpectedly. There was no panic in her voice, no emotional outburst. She didn't explain what was happening in detail, and she didn't even say Nick's name. She didn't have to. Instead, she asked questions that told Albert everything he needed to know. She asked about security systems. She asked about alarms. She asked about safe rooms. Albert pauses whenever he talks about that call because context matters. This wasn't someone living in fear of the outside world. This was Brentwood gated, guarded, insulated. Private streets, security patrols, multiple layers between the home and the public. Michelle wasn't worried about strangers. She wasn't worried about break-ins or random threats. She was afraid of someone who already had access, someone who knew the codes, someone who could walk through the front door without knocking. Albert told her not to wait. He told her to change everything immediately. Change the codes, bring in professional protection, create distance between fear and reality. He remembers being direct, even forceful, because for the first time, the danger felt undeniable. This wasn't about discomfort anymore. This was about safety. And what haunts Albert now isn't what he said, it's what he doesn't know. He doesn't know if she followed through. He doesn't know if the codes were changed. He doesn't know if protection was brought in. That uncertainty has become a loop he can't shut off. He replays the call over and over, dissecting every word, every pause, wondering if there was something else he should have said, something clearer, something more urgent. He wonders if he should have driven over himself instead of hanging up the phone. He wonders if being physically present might have shifted something even slightly. Michelle, in Albert's words, was the balance inside that house. The creative soul, the photographer, the artist, the one who tried to smooth things over and keep everyone grounded. Hearing fear in her voice quiet, controlled fear shook him in a way nothing else had, because it meant the situation had crossed a line long before anyone publicly acknowledged it. This wasn't a sudden realization. It was preparation. And preparation only happens when someone believes danger is no longer theoretical. Albert doesn't say this moment caused what came next. He's careful about that. But he does say it changed how he understood everything that had come before. All the dinners, all the excuses, all the hope that things would eventually calm down. That phone call reframed it all. It confirmed that the fear inside that house wasn't imagined, exaggerated, or temporary. It was real, and it had been living there quietly, waiting for someone to say it out loud. And now, after everything, that call sits at the center of Albert's grief. Not because it proves guilt, but because it represents a moment when the danger was seen clearly, and still, somehow, it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. Albert Brooks is careful not to let the story collapse into a single narrative of crisis, because to understand what was lost, you have to understand who Rob Reiner was when no one was watching. Not the public figure, not the director attached to legendary films, but the man who consistently showed up for other people, often quietly, often without recognition. Albert talks about Rob as a step-up guy, the kind of person who didn't wait to be asked. When someone needed help, Rob stepped in. When a door was closed, Rob looked for a way to open it. He connected people. He made calls. He vouched for talent that hadn't yet proven itself. And he did it without turning it into a transaction. No leverage, no expectation of loyalty in return. That part of Rob's character is echoed by the people who worked with him. Albert points to voices like Jerry O'Connell, who met Rob when he was still a kid, barely old enough to understand what opportunity even meant. Jerry describes Rob not as intimidating or distant, but as warm, someone who treated him like he belonged, someone without whom that project might never have happened. For a young actor, that kind of support doesn't just help a career, it shapes a sense of safety in an industry that rarely offers it. Kevin Pollak tells a similar story. He talks about Rob as someone who elevated the entire room, not just creatively, but personally. On set, Rob didn't just direct scenes. He created an environment where people felt seen, respected, and capable of doing their best work. Albert emphasizes this because it matters. This wasn't a man who took more than he gave. This was someone who consistently lifted others up. Albert even drifts into older memories, moments that used to feel light. A royal premiere in London, walking up the red carpet to meet Princess Diana, Rob teasing him the way only a lifelong friend can, calling him meathead no matter how many achievements followed. At the time, it was harmless, funny, a reminder of where they came from. Now, those memories don't bring comfort, they cut. Because they remind Albert that the man at the center of this story was not defined by chaos, but by decades of generosity and presence. That's why what happened hurts, in a way Albert struggles to explain. This wasn't a man who abandoned responsibility. This wasn't someone who turned away from people when things got hard. If anything, Rob stayed too long. He carried too much. He tried to fix what he believed love should be able to fix. And that instinct, the same instinct that made him show up for everyone else, is what ultimately made him vulnerable. Albert wants the audience to sit with that contradiction, because it's uncomfortable. The very qualities that made Rob admirable are the same ones that left him exposed. Kindness without limits, loyalty without boundaries. A belief that if you just stay present, just keep giving, things will eventually turn around. In Albert's view, that wasn't weakness, it was character. And that's what makes the loss so devastating. As the shock begins to settle, a quiet divide forms not out of anger, but out of survival. Albert makes it clear that grief doesn't move in one direction, and it doesn't demand the same response from everyone. For the Reiner siblings, Jake and Roy, the priority is peace. They have asked for privacy. They have asked the world to step back, not because they are hiding anything, but because continuing to relive the details feels unbearable. They are trying to hold two truths at once, to protect the memory of their parents, Rob and Michelle, without completely erasing their brother from their lives. That is an almost impossible line to walk. Albert acknowledges that. He says they are handling it with grace, with restraint, and with a level of emotional discipline most people never have to develop. They are grieving as children who lost their parents and a brother at the same time, and they are doing it under a spotlight they never asked for. But Albert also says something difficult. He says he is not walking that same path. Albert isn't family by blood. He doesn't carry the same obligation to forgive, to soften, or to move on quietly. His bond with Rob was different. It was built over 6 decades, shared beginnings, shared failures, shared laughter, and shared silence. Rob wasn't just someone he loved. Rob was part of his foundation, and when that foundation collapsed, Albert didn't feel comforted by peace. He felt haunted by what hadn't been said. That's where the tension lives. The family needs space to survive. The friend needs truth to breathe. Neither choice is wrong, but they cannot coexist easily. Albert understands why Jake and Roy want the story to stop. He respects their grief, but he also believes that silence has already done its damage. In his mind, staying quiet now doesn't honor Rob. It erases the reality Rob lived with. Albert is clear that he is not speaking to punish the family. He is speaking because Rob no longer can. Because the people who are gone cannot defend their choices, cannot explain their fear, cannot push back when the narrative begins to shift. Albert sees himself as a witness, not a judge. A living record of conversations that never made headlines, of warnings that stayed private, of moments when things felt wrong long before they became irreversible. And that decision to speak while others ask for quiet has consequences. It places Albert at odds with powerful people. It makes him uncomfortable to be around. It turns him from the funny voice in the background into someone the industry would rather avoid. But Albert accepts that cost. He says comfort is no longer the goal. Accuracy is. Because in Albert's view, grief doesn't require silence. And forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. Albert says he knows exactly what comes next because he's seen it too many times before. The story doesn't end with grief. It shifts. It softens. It gets rewritten. Not all at once, but slowly, through careful language and selective emphasis. He believes the groundwork is already being laid. He talks openly about the legal strategy forming around Nick. The defense attorney, Alan Jackson, is experienced, precise, and highly effective. Albert doesn't insult him. He doesn't question his skill. That's exactly what scares him. Because he knows how a courtroom narrative can be constructed not around facts alone, but around emotion, around explanations that feel compassionate enough to blur responsibility, Albert can already see the angle. Nick will be framed as a troubled young man crushed under the weight of expectation. A child of fame, a victim of pressure, addiction, and mental health struggles. The system failed him. The family did everything they could, and what happened will be described as inevitable, tragic, but ultimately not intentional. Albert believes that version of the story may resonate with a jury, and the possibility terrifies him. He's careful to draw a line. Albert does not deny mental illness. He does not deny addiction. He says those struggles were real and visible, but he refuses to let them become a full excuse. He grew up around addiction. He's seen people in dark places. He's watched lost kids claw their way back. And in his view, struggle explains behavior, it does not erase accountability. That's why Albert is speaking now, before the trial begins, not after verdicts are delivered, not after narratives are cemented. He says, once a story hardens in public consciousness, it becomes nearly impossible to undo. Sympathy replaces scrutiny, complexity replaces clarity, and the people who are gone lose their voice entirely. Albert has made his position clear. He plans to be in court in January, sitting front row behind the prosecution. He wants Nick to see him. He wants him to know that someone remembers every conversation, every warning, every excuse that was made along the way. Not to intimidate, not to provoke, but to stand as a living contradiction to a softened story. He says he isn't there to argue law. He's there to anchor reality, to remind the room that what happened didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of choices, years of protection, years of silence that slowly removed boundaries instead of reinforcing them. Albert also worries about what happens after the trial, regardless of outcome. He fears the blame will be redirected. That Rob will be quietly recast as a failed parent. That Michelle will be reduced to a passive figure. That love itself will be put on trial, twisted into something careless instead of vulnerable. He calls that the cruelest possibility of all, because the people being judged will no longer be alive to answer. In Albert's view, this isn't just about one family or one courtroom. It's about a culture that bends rules for the powerful and calls it compassion. A system that avoids intervention because intervention is uncomfortable. A pattern where consequences are delayed until damage becomes irreversible. That's why he refuses to stay quiet now. Because silence doesn't just protect reputations. Sometimes it builds the conditions for tragedy. What angers Albert most isn't just what happened, it's how the industry responded afterward. The flood of posts, the long captions, the carefully worded tributes from people claiming heartbreak and lifelong friendship. Albert says many of those same people hadn't spoken to Rob in years. Some stopped returning calls, some quietly pulled away when things got uncomfortable. He calls it performative grief, public emotion without private responsibility. Mourning after the fact, when nothing is required anymore. In Albert's view, that kind of grief is easy. Showing up before everything breaks is the hard part. He's especially disturbed by how freely people now speak about warning signs they never addressed. Whispers about Nick's instability, private jokes. Quiet cautions shared behind closed doors while doors to parties, studios, and social circles stayed open because of a famous last name. Albert doesn't name names, but he says everyone involved knows who they are. The loss didn't just take Rob away from the world. It took something from Albert, too. He admits he can't watch their old work anymore. The laughter doesn't land the same. Scenes that once felt light now carry weight. Every joke pulls him backward into memories he can't escape. Albert says the silence afterward is louder than anything he's ever heard. It follows him. It fills rooms. And that's why he keeps talking. Not for attention, not for punishment, but because silence already took too much and he refuses to let it take anything else. Albert Brooks says this isn't a story with a clean ending. There's no final twist that makes sense of everything, no resolution that restores what was lost. Real life doesn't offer that. It just keeps moving, leaving people behind with the weight. He says the hardest truth is also the simplest one. The signs were there. The discomfort was real. The warnings weren't subtle, they were just inconvenient. And when facing them felt too painful, silence felt easier, safer, kinder, until it wasn't. Albert isn't asking the world to choose sides. He isn't asking for outrage. He's asking for honesty, the kind that recognizes how love, when left unchecked, can stop protecting and start enabling. How good intentions, repeated long enough, can quietly remove the very boundaries meant to keep people safe. He says the most dangerous lies aren't the loud ones. They're the soft ones we tell ourselves. That things will calm down, that tomorrow will be different, that love alone will be enough. And that's the question Albert leaves hanging, because it doesn't belong to one family or one tragedy. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked at a situation and thought, "This doesn't feel right," and stayed quiet anyway. When does love stop saving the people we care about and start opening the door to what comes next?